Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to be focusing on how to create a sequence from the bass line, and a particular sequence in which we have a bass line dealing with falling thirds followed by rising seconds. Now, first of all, what's a sequence? Are we happy about a sequence? Well, a sequence is when you have a musical idea that repeats at a slightly different pitch. So it might be a note higher, a note lower, it might be a third higher, third lower, whatever. And as long as it's the same pattern that's repeating, that is a sequence. Why might people want to know about sequences? Well, if you're playing a piece of music, it may contain sequences within it. So if you're playing it, you might think, well, how am I phrasing this bar? Because if the next bar or the next measure is the same music in sequence, you might want to phrase it in the same way. If a sequence is being used to kind of build up a little bit of a musical climax, you might decide when you're playing that you want to deliver a crescendo through the sequence, for example. So there are implications for performers, so therefore worth just being aware of when sequences occur in the music. How are sequences useful to composers? Well, sometimes you've got a musical idea that works particularly well in sequence. So it's always a good idea to think about whether that's one way in which you want to present it. But there are also moments when you're writing where you need a little bit of musical glue between one place and another. So you've maybe stated your theme and maybe you've repeated the theme or modified it or done something with it. And then you're thinking, I just need a little connection between here and the next section of my piece. Sequences can be incredibly useful to join up corners of a piece. So as a compositional tool, they're very useful. If you're trying to do things, for example, like write a fugue, well, you'll have things called episodes in your fugue, which are passages between statements of the fugue subject. So often, composers like Bach, particularly in the Baroque, would use sequences to write these episodes. So sequences definitely worth engaging with if you've not really thought about them before. But then actually, how do we go about generating a sequence? And sometimes it's a great idea to think about a melodic idea and how does that play out if you move it up or down or whatever. But it's quite a good idea to think upwards from the bass line as well, and to think in chords. What about a chord sequence? And then to think, how might I decorate the chord sequence to turn it into something that's more interesting musically? So that's kind of what we're dealing with. Okay, well, have a look at this particular sequence that I'm trying to illustrate here by looking at the bass line. And you'll notice that this particular bass line starts on F, it goes down a third to D, it comes up a second to E, goes down a third to C, comes up a second to D, goes down a third to B, comes up a second to C. And of course you could keep going all day long. And that is a danger. So let's just talk about that briefly. Whenever you get a sequential idea and you think, great, this is just filling up bar after bar, measure after measure of my music, isn't that terrific? The danger is that it becomes predictable. Now, you can do things like have a sequence that works one way in this bar or this measure, and then maybe is reorganized a little bit in the next bar. Two parts switch over or something like that, or there's some different kind of modification to it. If you're going to repeat it exactly as it is, then I think there's always a danger once you've done it more than 3 times that it starts to become a little bit predictable, because if you've done this 3 times, well, if you do it 4 times, 5 times, 6 times, after a while we're beginning to think, oh my goodness, this is just going on and on. So you don't want it to do that, but if you do it sort of 3 times exactly the same, then you could start another sequence, or having done a sequence that's basically descending, you might then think, I'll put another sequence on after this, which is basically ascending. The other great advantage, though, of doing a sequence that takes up kind of 3 bars or 3 measures of music, because you're repeating it 3 times, is that one more bar, one more measure, and you've got a 4-bar phrase. So if you're writing some bit of connection between one musical idea and the next, actually a 4 measure, a 4-bar connection is often ideally what you want. And if you want 8 bars or 8 measures, well, put 2 sequences in there, or use 1 sequence and something that's not a sequence. But it's a useful tool to work with. Okay, so let's get back to this particular example. So we've talked about this bass falling a third, rising a second, and now let's have a design for the chords so that that sort of fits with the sequence. Okay, now we're in C major just for ease, but we're starting on a chord 4. Now you'll notice one thing I'm doing here, just a very simple thing with 3 parts at the moment. You can make it more complex in due course if you want to. But if we start with a chord 4 like this, when the bass falls a third, we can go to this chord, which is actually a 7B chord, or a 7 in first inversion chord. But what I'm really getting to is that root position chord alternates with a first inversion chord. Root position, first inversion, root position, first inversion, root position. Or if you're thinking of this in figured bass terms, it's a 5-3 chord followed by a 6-3. 5-3, 6-3, 5-3, 6-3, back to 5-3 again at the end. And you'll also notice that I've tried to get a line at the top, very simple design, that's kind of going in contribution with the bass. But do you see what's happening in this upstairs line? It's going in contrimotion with the bass, which is quite useful because it means you don't fill the whole world with parallel fifths and octaves and so on, but it gets a little bit of independence in the top part and gets a little bit of dialogue going. But you'll also notice what's happening at the top. We're going up a second, down a third, up a second, down a third, up a second, down a third. So it's the same pattern as this, down a third, up a second, but kind of working in reverse. So that's quite neat. And the middle part, at the moment, I'm just keeping really simple, just these sustained notes to kind of complete a chord. So if you want to write in a 3-part texture, this gives you the essentials of what you might need to do that. Okay, so you can see how I'm doing this alternation of root position and first inversion. And if we're going to just put some chord numbers on this, so if we're in the key of C major, well, as I say, that's a chord 4, and then it's going to a 7 in first inversion, a 7B, or you might know that as a 7-6, that's absolutely fine. And then of course we end up with chord 3, and some people will be thinking, oh, chord 3, that's not very often used, is it, chord 3? Well, it is, but it's not as frequently used as other chords. What you will find, though, when you write a sequence, is that you end up using chords like 7 and 3 more readily in a sequence than you might do in your otherwise everyday musical life, which is another thing that makes it a little bit more varied. Also, by the way, 3 is a very good chord to use after a 7 in first inversion. So that happens to work out quite nicely as well, doesn't it? So then we move on to 6 in first inversion, so 6B or a 6-6 if you want to call it that. Then we've got chord 2, and then we've got chord 5 in first inversion, and then we've got chord 1. So you see how this pattern of chords works out as well, because we're working down from 4 to 3 to 2 to 1, and from 7 to 6 to 5. So the chord pattern rolls out with it as well. So we've got 4, 7B, 3, 6B, 2, 5B, 1. Okay, well, there's the pattern. Now, it sounds a little bit kind of boring as it stands, doesn't it? You might decide if you're writing something that's got a very calm mood that you don't want a lot of rhythmic and melodic activity. There's something as bold as that would serve a purpose. However, what happens if you want to kind of decorate this thing in some way? Well, let me show you what I've done here. In the bass line, I've just used the F going down to D, But what I've done here is to repeat the F and then to have a passing note or a passing tone in there. And I'm doing exactly the same pattern here and exactly the same pattern there. Okay, so that's decorating the bass. So if I use the original pattern, but I just show how that sounds with this bass decoration, you get this. Well, it immediately injects a little bit of rhythmic interest into the bass line, little bit of melodic interest with that passing note, that passing tone as well. I'm just trying to show how you can decorate this in a very simple way and just kind of transform it a little bit. You'll also notice that I've introduced this melodic pattern and rhythmic pattern into the top part. Now, what am I doing here? Because we started with this B, didn't we? So I've got the B here and here. So what are these other two notes? Well, this C is an upper auxiliary note or an upper neighbour tone, if you know it as that. And this is a passing note or a passing tone. And it's unaccented because it comes between the beats, doesn't come on the beat. So just by decorating with an upper auxiliary or an upper neighbour tone and a passing note or a passing tone, we get a little figure out of that you can use. And then of course I'm repeating that in sequence and doing the same thing there. Now, if I do that with the bass line that we've just elaborated, we get this. Now you can see how just a little bit of decoration kind of makes the original bold scheme kind of come to life a bit. Here's the original. Here's the elaboration. Now I haven't done anything as yet anyway to the middle part that's just going along with long sustained notes. Sometimes it's quite nice if you're in three parts to have this little dialogue going between the outer parts. You know, you've got the bass moving here. When the bass is steady, the top part moves, and the same again here. So we get this kind of little exchange going between two parts. Well, you might want to do something more sophisticated than that. You might try to run that between the three parts, or you might like to make this slightly less predictable by moving in the upper part here, but then moving in the middle part at this point by some means. But you see how you do this by using these inessential notes, these auxiliary notes or passing notes. So neighbour tones, passing tones, just to decorate a basic sequence. So this is just kind of getting into thinking about how do we write a sequence? How, if we haven't really got a melodic idea we can run with, how can we plan that from the bass line? So this little idea, falling third, rising second, falling third, and so on. So you get that pattern going in the bass, then you work out this alternation of root position with first inversion, root position, first inversion, work out what the chords are above the bass line, and then use that as the basis that you can decorate this with. And you could do this in any style. This is slightly baroque as it stands, but you could do it in any other style. So I think it's a really useful compositional device just to think about, can I use sequence particularly as a means of kind of musical connection between one place and another? And what ideas do we have for sequence? Well, here's one that you could play around with. I mean, you can change the accidentals. You know, we can start with this and go through flat keys. So I'm now in B flat major. Do you see how I'm doing that? You could do it with sharps. This is the great thing about a sequence. You can kind of use them to manipulate modulation if you want, or you can just stick in the same key as I've done here. But anyway, I hope that gets you kind of started with a straightforward idea for writing a sequence. Well, if you've enjoyed this video, let me invite you to the Music Matters website, www.mmcourses.com. And if you're really wanting to kind of get some of this harmony going under your fingers, let me recommend our keyboard harmony course, which kind of takes you on an A to Z journey, kind of working with chords under your fingers. So if you're a keyboard player, or even if you're not a fantastic keyboard player, but you can get your fingers on the keys, it will help you to hear what's going on with the chords, and then you'll be able to use ideas that you've got in your head and think, I've got an idea how to write those down, I've got an idea what they feel like at the keyboard, and that will be a very useful skill to acquire. Lots of other stuff there, but there's one course in particular that you might find particularly helpful. Other things on the website, including our Maestros group, have a look at that while you're there. www.mmcourses.co.uk.